Our next speaker is another board member. She's going to talk 7 days in September, Anthrax links to the day of 9/11 itself, and it's Barbara Honegger. Barbara is a board member, is a researcher, and she is the officer in the Lawyers Committee. She was at one time a special assistant to the president, the White House policy analyst and director of the Attorney General's Law Review and Department of Justice. She served as a senior military affairs journalist at the Naval Postgraduate School. Barbara has been very active in 9/11. She was really instrumental in the three beams, the third beam spotlight that was shown in New York City skyline on the 9th anniversary of September 11th. She's been very involved this year too with trying to get a banner to go fly over New York City. And she earned a bachelor's degree of arts from the Stanford University, a master's degree from John F. Kennedy University, and a master level certification in national security decision making from Naval War College. She has twice run for Congress from the California Central Coast District. The last time on a 9/11 Truth platform, I present to you Barbara Honegger. Hey, Barb.
Hi, Dave. Well, I'd like to begin, before I get into my formal presentation, by just letting everybody know that, like many of you, you may have been watching the events at Ground Zero in Shanksville and the Pentagon. I watched them all. And the message that our entire government and military is trying to make the public accept, and I'm going to quote from General Mark Milley, who is the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. At the Pentagon, in his address, he said, "It is finally time to close this terrible 9/11 chapter in our nation's history." And those of us who are in the Lawyers Committee and have been in the 9/11 Truth Movement and know what the facts are, and you're going to see a lot of the facts in my presentation tonight, that most people even in our movement don't know about the anthrax attacks and their direct links to 9/11 itself. We know that our work has only just begun. Not only can we not close out this terrible chapter in American history, we have to succeed at our task in order to save our country. And we know that. So now I'm going to go to my slides. My presentation is called 7 Days in September, the Anthrax Links to the Day of 9/11 itself. Now I want you to look on the left and you'll see the World Trade Center towers, both of them, one of them just hit and the other's smoking. And on the right, you're going to see one of the anthrax letters being held up by, probably it could even be the scapegoat by the FBI, Bruce Ivins himself. And the reason I've put this white space in between them is I want you to imagine now a bridge between them. I want you to imagine that bridge that you see in the New York photo on the left. I want you to imagine that extending over to the anthrax letter. And the reason I called it 7 Days in September is because the government wants you to believe the official story of anthrax and its links or lack thereof to 9/11. They want you to believe that there is no connection whatsoever in the physical world or in the minds of the top leaders of the Bush-Cheney administration and in Mayor Giuliani's office in New York City between the day of 9/11 itself and anthrax, because the official story says there's no possible knowledge that anyone in the government or Giuliani's office in New York, the mayor's office in New York, could possibly have imagined that there were going to be anthrax attacks for a very long time. And in fact, that the official story, which is true in this case, says that the first letters that we know of weren't mailed for exactly a week after 9/11, and therefore 7 Days in September, which is, of course, a takeoff on the famous book and movie 7 Days in May, about a coup attempt by an Air Force general against the elected government and president of the United States. So if I could have the next slide, please. We have the next slide. I guess you're seeing the next slide. Okay, I have to move something over so I can see that as well. All right, so the government's own official story, as I mentioned, is that the anthrax attacks, or I haven't mentioned it yet, were an inside job. This is what the government itself says. The government says that the letter anthrax that was in those attack letters, they have pinned this on the Lee Harvey Oswald of the anthrax attacks, a man by the name of Bruce Ivins who was working at Fort Detrick. And so the official story of our government is that the one they settled on, is that the anthrax in these attack letters came from a US military laboratory. That's as inside job as you can get. Now, our Lawyers Committee, in both our filings with Congress and the one that we filed today with the US Attorney for the District of Columbia, with a letter also to the US Attorney, we have made it clear in this excruciatingly documented 136-page filing that Bruce Ivins, not only the scapegoat of the anthrax attacks, not only didn't do it, but couldn't have done it any more physically than the World Trade Center towers and World Trade Center 7 came down simply because of, in the case of the Twin Towers, the plane impacts and fires. Physically impossible, and it was also, we've shown, physically impossible for Bruce Ivins, the government scapegoat of the anthrax letter attacks, to have done it. He couldn't have done it. So the government wants you to believe, however, that it was an inside job. In our filings, we've pointed to different government laboratories or government contractors, but not Bruce Ivins and not Fort Detrick. So the government says the anthrax attacks were an inside job. Therefore, if we are able to demonstrate any clear links, let alone multiple clear links and strong links, between the anthrax attacks, which the government itself is saying was an inside job, if we are able to establish clear links between the anthrax attacks that they say are an inside job and 9/11 itself, that is a way to, in effect, box the government into effectively admitting that 9/11 itself was also an inside job. And that is what I'm going to try to establish in my presentation today. And I should be clear that our Lawyers Committee has not taken a public position on the information in this presentation, although I am on the Anthrax Research Committee, and I have presented it to the committee and to the board, and it will be taken into consideration in future filings that we are planning. If I may have the next slide, please. Okay, so here's a summary of what you're about to see. I'm going to demonstrate to you in this presentation that there were warnings, and you can infer foreknowledge of the anthrax letter attacks before 9/11, not even just on 9/11, but before 9/11. In fact, well before 9/11. There were warnings about anthrax, even by agents of the FBI, to citizens who had their offices in the World Trade Center towers on 9/11 itself. You will see that. President Bush and his White House staff on Air Force One on 9/11 were put on anti-anthrax Cipro on board on board Air Force One as it was flying back to the White House from Offutt Air Force Base on 9/11 itself. And there was an anthrax attack counterterrorism exercise called Tripod 2 that was pre-planned and about to be actually physically executed in New York City, in Brooklyn, on September 12th, the day after 9/11, with FEMA and many other government exercise personnel, firefighters from the New York Fire Department and the New York Police Department and many others involved, hundreds of personnel who were in New York City on September 10th, before 9/11. Next slide, please. All right. This was a short clip, and like Dave Meischwinkel's, some of my clips didn't work, so I'm going to now read you what Giuliani says, this is a clip, a short, about minute clip, a little bit less, from his under oath testimony to the 9/11 Commission. And in this case, this is what he said, and I will have to read it to you. So in this clip, he says, Giuliani under oath to the 9/11 Commission, in all of the briefings, and I put in parentheses because it's clear from the context, of all the briefings of potential terrorism threats against New York City that Giuliani received as the mayor of New York, continuing the quote, the two areas that were emphasized to him were bombings, this is a quote now, bombings meaning suicide type bombings, or an area we have not talked much about yet, but we should talk more about if we're looking toward the future, is biological and chemical attacks, unquote. If I may have the next slide, please. All right. So New York, this is another slide, another short video clip that won't play. And so I'm going to also read you what that one says. This is also a little bit later in Giuliani's testimony to the 9/11 Commission. And he says here, 9/11, meaning New York's response to it, was overwhelmed that day. Should it have been larger? Should it have been anticipated, meaning the attacks? Yes, it probably should have, but it wasn't. It was just one of those things that was not anticipated. If that information, meaning warnings, had been given to us, or more warnings, I underline the word more in his quote, because we do know that he was given warnings by the FBI, or more warnings had been given to us, meaning the mayor's office in New York, in 2001 before the attacks, I can't honestly tell you if we would have done anything differently. We, meaning his office in New York City, were doing at the time all we could think of, unquote. So this is Mayor Giuliani saying he couldn't possibly have imagined what happened on 9/11 or the Anthrax attacks. Could we have the next slide, please? All right. So Mayor Giuliani said he couldn't imagine, and yet it is a fact that his own World Trade Center 7 Office of Emergency Management on the 23rd floor of World Trade Center 7 had spent months leading up to 9/11 preparing for the execution of an anthrax attack counterterrorism exercise called Tripod 2 that was ready and set to begin in New York City on September 12th, the day after the 9/11 attacks, the same months, this is very important, that we now know, and the Lawyers Committee has taken a public position on this, a formal one, the very same months leading up to 9/11, that controlled demolition, explosives, and incendiaries were being pre-placed throughout World Trade Center 7. All right. Now, it is also very important to note that the Office of Emergency Management, which was Giuliani's own mayor's office, 23rd floor of World Trade Center 7, that was where the Tripod 2 anthrax attack exercise, due to be run on September 12th, was organized with the oversight of Vice President Cheney, because he was put in charge of all counterterrorism preparedness and exercises by President Bush on May 8th of 2001, and also in coordination with FEMA's Office of National Preparedness. And at the bottom of this slide, there is a link that you will be able to see all of that. If I could have the next slide. All right, so the Tripod 2 anthrax counterterrorism exercise, I'm now going to read you because I wasn't able to get that quote to go either, but I'm going to read you the quote from under oath in Giuliani's testimony to the 9/11 Commission. And I think it's extremely important that this quote was so explosive that the 9/11 Commission chose just this transcript from his videotape testimony, recorded videotape testimony, not to include for quite some time on the 9/11 Commission's own website. And this is the quote. This is Giuliani. Our number 2 backup command center on 9/11 would have been the New York Police Department. They actually first went to the police academy. That didn't work. And he continues, 7 World Trade Center, that's World Trade Center 7, was the primary one. But in other words, his official primary Office of Emergency Management, where the anthrax Tripod 2 exercise was organized. But continuing the quote, but then we realized pretty shortly on 9/11 that the police academy, where they first went, was too small. And then we selected Pier 92 as our 9/11 response and search and rescue command center. And the reason Pier 92 was selected as our command center was because on the next day, on September 12th, Pier 92 was already going to have the drill. It had hundreds of people here already in New York City, from FEMA, from the federal government, from the state of New York, from the State Emergency Management Office, all of these, and they were getting ready for the drill, the Tripod 2 Anthrax attack drill for a biochemical attack. So that was going to be the place where they were going to have the drill. All the equipment was already there. So we were able to quickly establish our command center there that was 2.5 to 3 times bigger than the World Trade Center Office of Emergency Management official command center that we had lost in World Trade Center 7 that day. It was from there, that is on Pier 92, in the Tripod 2 Anthrax Attack Exercise Command Center, that the rest of the entire search and rescue effort for the 9/11 response in New York City was completed. May I have the next slide, please? All right. So it is important for people to know that it happens that the day that the Tripod 2 exercise, the anthrax attack exercise, was planned to begin, and these hundreds of personnel were already in New York City on the 10th, the day before 9/11, that happened to be the day, and this is a personal opinion, but I do not believe it is a coincidence that that was the day the $240 billion in covert CIA securities or federal bonds that had been used to destabilize the Russian ruble, then the Soviet ruble in the past, were to come due. And so had there not been a plane attack, they would have then been able to piggyback a real anthrax attack of some kind to shut this down, just like they shut down these securities being claimed because of the attacks on the Twin Towers. All right, may I have the next slide, please? All right, this is just quickly going through these slides. I have been publishing this information about the 9/11 links to anthrax and the anthrax links to the day of 9/11 itself, as well as before 9/11, as we've just gone over, for many years. My first publication was in September, right around the anniversary, just after of 2008, in Op-Ed News. May I have the next slide, please? It's also, my work is mentioned in Michael Rupert's very famous book called Crossing the Rubicon, one of the very first books on 9/11 truth ever published. And the important chapters there are the ones about the military exercises on 9/11. He does have a section on the anthrax attacks. Most people don't know that. Next slide, please. All right, I also published this in the Rock Creek Free Press. Next slide, please. All right, also I've been on the Architects and Engineers affiliated Andy Steele 9/11 Free Fall radio show on this. Next slide, please. So that just gives you an idea. I've been doing it for a long time. Everybody should watch this 9/11 War Games. I don't believe this is by James Corbett, who's going to be one of our speakers in this later in our event. I don't believe, I haven't watched it in a while. It's a really important video. You can see it in the archives on the Corbett Report about all of the exercises, counterterrorism exercises and war games that were going on 9/11 that basically simulated, if you will, the actual attacks on the World Trade Center towers in New York City and also at the Pentagon. Most people don't know about that. Next slide, please. All right. These exercises, I don't think it's a coincidence. If you remember Dave Meiswinkle's opening presentation in which he channeled Patrick Henry in a great way. These anthrax, the US military exercises, advanced practiced not only the 9/11 attacks and the anthrax attacks, but also the coronavirus outbreak in Wuhan. So I interviewed, when I was at the Naval Postgraduate School as a senior military affairs journalist there, I interviewed, he came to the Naval Postgraduate School here in Monterey, California, where I live and where I am right now. And I interviewed him. And in that interview, which I published on a DoD website publication, he said that we, meaning the federal government, and he was the counterterrorism czar in the White House at the time, leading up to 9/11, on 9/11, and after, he said, quote, we practiced it, and it was clear from the context that he was talking about attacks in the scenario type of 9/11. We practiced it, that is 9/11 type scenarios in counterterrorism exercises 5 times in the lead up to 9/11. And if you go to the 9/11 Commission staff reports, you will see a list of those 9/11-like terrorist attacks, including some on the World Trade Center, most of them, in fact, beginning on September 8th, as I recall. And there was also one on 9/11 that has been acknowledged by the man who ran it at NORAD Northeast Sector. The biowarfare attack exercise, Dark Winter, was practiced in the summer, June or July of 2001. It practiced a response to a bio attack. In that case, it was an anthrax, but it might as well have been. And Event 201 was a biopathogen outbreak counterterrorism exercise that was also practiced. It practiced the Wuhan coronavirus outbreak in mid-October 2019, effectively simultaneously with the actual start of the Wuhan military games, where the outbreak, there is evidence, began in actuality, and where at least 5 US military personnel athletes came down with COVID-like symptoms and had to be briefly hospitalized in Wuhan. May I have the next slide, please? Mayor Giuliani's World Trade Center 7 Office of Emergency, on September 11th, Jerome Hauer, the first director and founding director of Giuliani's World Trade Center Office of Emergency Management, that was moved to Pier 91, that had already been set up before 9/11 as the Anthrax attack exercise command center. He was an expert on the responses to building collapses, was very proud of that expertise of his. He urgently, on 9/11, on the evening of 9/11, about 5:20 or so, he urgently put Vice President Cheney's White House staff on anti-anthrax Cipro. You have to ask yourself why. He did it in an urgent basis. Also, the father of the US biowarfare program itself during the Cold War, William Patrick, said in a PBS interview that you can see online, quote, you need to go on antibiotics in the first 24 hours if you have anthrax, if you have inhalation anthrax. If symptoms from inhalation anthrax develop, it's almost certainly too late and you will probably die. Now, this fact is extremely important because it rules out, as you'll see in a moment, that Bush's own White House staff, as well as Vice President Cheney's White House staff, were all put on Cipro on 9/11 itself. And it had to have been due to an imminent fear of anthrax having possibly already been in the White House or possibly already be on Air Force One, and not a fear of a future or a second wave anthrax attack. Very important. Next slide, please. All right. I'm not going to read all of this, but when you see my slides online, because this will be archived on the YouTube channel, the Lawyers Committee YouTube channel, and also the superu.net YouTube platform. I'm not going to read this, but I will give you the summary of it. President Bush and his entire White House staff with him on Air Force One on 9/11, on the trip back to Washington, D.C. from Offutt Air Force Base, were put on anti-anthrax Cipro by the president's own White House physician who was on the plane with him. They were all put on anti-anthrax Cipro, so that when they arrived in the White House, after they got down at Andrews Air Force Base and were piloted in Marine Corps One helicopter to the White House, Cheney's staff was already on anti-anthrax Cipro, and everyone from Air Force One arrived, including President Bush himself, having just been put on anti-anthrax Cipro by the president's own White House physician. Next slide, please. All right, I think this is important. It's important because the Naval Command Center was investigating, I needed, this slide is slightly out of order, but I mentioned in a previous slide that September 12th, which was the planned day to begin the anthrax attack exercise in Brooklyn and other parts of New York City, even though not technically lower Manhattan, but parts of New York City. That was to be on the day after 9/11, on September 12th. And on September 12th, as I mentioned, that was the day that these Black Eagle Fund, CIA covert, $250 billion federal securities were to come due, to be claimed. And that didn't happen because of the attacks of 9/11. But those $240 to $250 billion of covert CIA securities were being investigated by the Naval Command Center, Naval Intelligence Cell. And that Naval Intelligence Cell was targeted by inside pre-placed explosives. And if I could have the next slide, please. The slide that you just saw is from the Washington Post the day after 9/11, and it shows where that intel cell was, and the title of the diagram is The Targeted Ones, and the content of the article is about how it was targeted. And if you go to my Behind the Smoke Curtain, which is my documentary on YouTube, at the link that you see at the top, the short link, you will see all of the evidence for how the Naval Command Center, Naval Intelligence Cell within the Naval Command Center that was investigating those very $240 billion of securities that were never claimable, those CIA secret securities that were used to try to destroy the economy of the Soviet Union, and presumably successfully so because it fell after that, that the Naval Intelligence Cell and the Naval Command Center that had pre-placed explosives on 9/11 was investigating that. May I have the next slide, please? Okay, anthrax dispersion tests and counterterrorism exercises using an anthrax simulant, very important. What's an anthrax simulant? There are a number of different anthrax simulants, and maybe we should more specifically say deadly anthrax simulants. It's a bacterium that is very similar in the way that it would be dispersed through the air. And that's the reason that they use it instead of deadly anthrax for their simulation exercises, usually to see how the real thing, if it was used as a bioweapon against an enemy, as it might have been during the Cold War, either by the Soviet Union against us or vice versa, that simulant is used instead to see how it would disperse. And the United States military has a long history during the Cold War of using such anthrax stimulants with CIA involvement in the 1950s and 60s in particular. The US military conducted secret open-air tests in US cities using an anthrax stimulant, usually Bacilli globigli, and I'm probably mispronouncing that, also known as B. globigli, also known as Bacillus subtilis, variant Niger. And these exercises exposed literally millions of innocent American civilians in New York City, Washington, D.C., San Francisco, and other cities in the 1950s and 60s. So next slide, please. And why is that important for the anthrax attacks? FBI personnel were warned. I believe, haven't we skipped a slide, maybe? Could we go back? Nope, I guess not. Okay. Well, I'll just say what's in the slide that should have been here, and then when we get to it, I can repeat it briefly. And that is that it's extremely important that one of the contaminants, the kind of signature fingerprint contaminants in some, but not all, but some of the anthrax, in the anthrax attack letters in the wake of 9/11 had anthrax simulant in it. And a simulant would only be in the envelope. It wasn't just stimulant, but there were traces of stimulant in at least the envelope or the letter that was mailed to the New York Post, which was in the very first batch of letters that were mailed, presumably from a mailbox near Princeton University in New Jersey. And that was on exactly 1 week after 9/11 on September 18th. That's the title of my talk, 7 Days in September. So now this slide. FBI personnel were actually warned of an Anthrax airliner plane link. And now you're going to hear the brief statement to the New York Oral History Project. Hopefully the volume can be turned up, by Bruno Dellinger, who had his office in pretty high up in World Trade Center 1. But he had luckily left the building and was pulled into Deutsche Bank, I believe. In his oral history, he says a bank, but by his description, it probably almost certainly was Deutsche Bank. He was pulled in as as World Trade Center 2, the first of the two towers to collapse, was collapsing, and the pyroclastic cloud was barreling towards him down the street. He was pulled inside the bank building, just inside the plate glass doors, by an FBI agent who told him what you're about to hear. This is about a minute clip, an audio clip. It takes a second to start. Is it beginning? It looks like it's going, and I'm not hearing it. So I'm going to assume you're not hearing it if I'm not hearing it. So I'm going to tell you, and I will try to substitute one that is audible when we post this on the Lawyers Committee YouTube channel. So what Bruno Dellinger is saying here in his official testimony to the New York Oral History Project, and it's online, this is a clip from it in which he's saying that this FBI agent, as this pyroclastic cloud barrels down the street on the outside of the huge plate glass doors of the bank, tells him, we were told this was going to happen, and as soon as you can, go to a hospital and have yourself checked for anthrax. And Bruno says, well, why? And the man says, because you don't know what were on those planes. And interestingly, when you read the quote in a previous slide by President Bush's physician on Air Force One, on the plane back to Washington, D.C. on 9/11 itself, where Bush and his entire White House staff and all the military staff on the plane, for that matter, were put on anti-anthrax Cipro, a week's worth, a regime of anti-anthrax Cipro. One of them is quoted as asking the physician, well, why are you doing this? And the physician says words almost identical to what the FBI agent said to Bruno Dellinger. He said, well, because there could be anthrax. All right, next slide, please. All right, on 9/11 itself, Richard Pearl, who is a leading signatory and principal of the Project for New American Century document that was published exactly a year before 9/11 and called for the famous call for a new Pearl Harbor, which was, of course, 9/11 exactly a year later. That PNAC manifesto, and that's my word, manifesto, which was intended to, it called for a new Pearl Harbor to cement US global dominance. And on mainstream television on 9/11, Richard Pearl asked the question to an audience of millions, well, what if the World Trade Center, I'm adding World Trade Center, he said, what if the plane was full of anthrax? Isn't that interesting? He's not the only Project for New American Century major signatory who said that on mainstream television in New York City on 9/11 or the next day. Next slide, please. All right, there were variants in the anthrax letters. There were variants in the anthrax letters. In fact, one of the important signatures, if not the most important signature, that the FBI's investigation honed in on based upon which we show in our anthrax petition that we have just filed with the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia and sent a copy to the U.S. Attorney of the United States, Merrick Garland, we are able to show that even though the FBI was right to home in on these so-called variants, they were called morph or morphological variants, slight changes and differences in the anthrax after it was analyzed, when it was analyzed. These variants were used as an important signature for trying to identify who had the anthrax, and on the assumption that the person who had the anthrax that went in the letters also mailed the letters, which of course was an assumption that has not been proven by any evidence whatsoever. So where have you heard the word variants before? All right, next slide. We're getting to the end. The government's anthrax attacks Patsy, Bruce Ivans, we have shown in our filing that we filed today, did not do it and could not have done it. And this is based upon compelling, multiple, dispositive lines of converging lines of evidence in our anthrax grand jury petition filed today with the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia and a copy to the U.S. Attorney of the United States. The bottom line, the perpetrators of the bioweapon anthrax attacks on the U.S. Congress, on 2 senators with highly weaponized anthrax at 1 trillion spores per gram. This is the most highly weaponized anthrax that had ever been seen in the United States or anywhere else. The anthrax killers, killers are still at large. They still have access to anthrax, almost certainly, and they could do it again. If you could go back, please. Please go back. No, one forward now. No, no, back. Yes, thank you. Stay there, please. I'm almost done with this slide. So, the anthrax, Patsy didn't do it, couldn't have done it. The real bioweapon WMD attackers are still at large, can do it again. And in this conference, we will soon hear evidence that the coronavirus was gain of function bioengineered as well. We have not taken a position on this. We have not studied it, but we are going to listen to our experts on this today. The symptoms of anthrax and flu significantly overlap. That's incredibly important to know. And the most important to me, the final point here, the government, or the US government, is right now funding research on a coronavirus anthrax hybrid. This would be the perfect bioweapon. Why? Because anthrax is highly deadly, but not very contagious. And the coronavirus Delta variant and probably future variants are not very deadly, despite what the government wants you to believe, but they are. But the Delta variant in particular is highly contagious. You put together the lethality of anthrax and the high contagiousness of the coronavirus variant, and our government is putting them together right now. And we have Whitney Webb, who is one of the speakers later in our program, to thank for her great research on that, revealing that to us. Next slide, please, very quickly, almost done. Okay, yeah, this is just, I'm not going to read it, but this is just taken from Whitney Webb's article, which is called Engineering Contagion, the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center, Coronathrax. She put together coronavirus and anthrax, called it Coronathrax and the Darkest Winter, about the dark winter exercise that, quote, practiced, unquote, the coming actual anthrax attacks in the summer of 2001. Next slide, please. All right, I'm not going to, well, we'll see if this plays. It's a very short clip, and this would be the end of my presentation. If you can't hear it, I'll come back and end, but hopefully. This is Bob McIlvaine, who is one of our most courageous family members, victims' family members, and also one of the most courageous activists and researchers that we have. Let's see if it will play. looks like maybe not. It played earlier, but okay. So I just want to end with, in a very positive note, which this video would have been. And it is a really positive note, and it just shows you the importance of the anthrax attacks. And that is, in our investigation for the petition that we just filed today on the anthrax attacks with the U.S. Attorney for the District of Columbia and a copy to the U.S. Attorney of the United States. In that investigation, we looked into a very important lawsuit that was brought by Maureen Stevens, who is the wife of the very first anthrax victim, the very first to die. He died on October 5th of 2001 from inhalation anthrax. Robert Bob, known as Bob Stevens, in Florida. And he worked for American Media Inc. In Florida. And he received, the FBI assumes, an anthrax-laced letter, an extremely deadly one, because that anthrax was so aerosolized that it went throughout the entire building. The entire building had to be quarantined afterwards, and all of the staff moved to an entirely different building. They never did return. And so Maureen Stevens, after her husband died, she sued the U.S. government. She also sued a U.S. government contractor that is heavily referenced in our anthrax petition that we just filed today, and that's Battelle Memorial Institute in Ohio. And so she sued Battelle Memorial Institute, which interestingly is a foreign corporation. And it's also a major contractor for the anthrax-related work in conjunction with Fort Detrick in the lead up to 9/11 and the anthrax, the 9/11 linked anthrax attacks, if I've proven in this presentation. Well, she sued the government and Battelle Memorial Institute for not having proper security procedures on the, and she used the government's own theory that it had come from Fort Detrick, that it had come from Bruce Ivan's flask. Well, we've proven that isn't the case. Not the anthrax that actually made it into the letters, which was much more highly processed than the parent anthrax that was in his flask. However, what happened is when she sued the government, believe it or not, this is critical for what's happening right now with the coronavirus and what's happening with our cases, all of them, that the Lawyers Committee has filed on behalf of 9/11 victims' family members, let alone the Lawyers Committee, architects and engineers, other victims, for instance, of inhalation, the ground zero problems with lung ailments and that kind of thing. The government actually has told us that American citizens do not have standing to bring a grand jury petition against the federal government or any of its agents. Well, Maureen, the federal government actually said in its defense in Maureen Stevens' case, the government actually says that the United States government does not have an affirmative duty to protect the citizens of the United States. I want to repeat that. In the major case by the first anthrax victim, by his wife, for his death, the government's defense against her lawsuit, the government's defense as defendants was that the federal government has no affirmative duty to protect any American citizen from anything. And in particular, Maureen Stevens said that the government surely would have to have an affirmative duty to protect its citizens from an ultra high risk like of anthrax that is known to be extremely deadly and that actually provably killed her husband. And that was agreed to by the government. They stipulated that her husband died of inhalation anthrax. And the government's own theory in the case that they stipulated was that it came from, allegedly from Fort Detrick. Well, she appealed. And the 11th Circuit Federal Court, and I believe that's as high as the decision has gone. So the decision applies only to the states in that circuit. But the 11th Circuit Federal Court ruled against the government, and in a very strongly worded opinion, that is, I understand, standing law in the 11th Federal Circuit of the United States now, as we speak, that the 11th Circuit ruled that yes, the federal government has an affirmative duty to protect American citizens, and not just from ultra high risk pathogens like anthrax. And that even though she was claiming that it might have come from Battelle Memorial Institute in Ohio, and that the government stipulated that somehow it got to Fort Detrick or vice versa with Bruce Ivins, that nevertheless, anywhere in the country, that the federal government was responsible for the death of her husband. So this is an incredibly important precedent, and the way that fate has made this work is that if it hadn't have been for the anthrax attack, there wouldn't today be a federal ruling in federal court in the 11th District that the federal government has any affirmative duty to protect any American citizen. And you have to wonder what's really behind the federal government saying that even 9/11 victims and 9/11 victims' family members who lost their loved ones in the towers do not have standing to sue. I think that this mentality of the federal government, that they are totally sovereign, even against deaths, horrendous deaths by ultra high risk pathogens like anthrax, that they have no affirmative duty, again, to protect their own citizens, that finally this has been overturned in the 11th Circuit. So thank you for your attention, and I hope you now understand that there are definitive 9/11 links to anthrax.
Thank you very much, Barbara.